All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Felix Davila. I'm the Young Adult Programming Specialist with the Pratt Library, and welcome to another edition of Pratt's YA Writers Live. Thank you for joining us. We are currently located in the meeting room of the Southeast Anchor Library here in Baltimore. And as a quick reminder, all of our locations are currently open at 50% capacity, so please come visit us. We look forward to seeing you. And right now we are broadcasting live online to Facebook and YouTube, so thank you to our virtual audience. And a quick thank you to Baltimore City Public Schools. We have some students here. Thanks for joining us today live and in person. And as a quick reminder to our guests here in person, masks are to be on throughout the duration of the event, so please be cognizant of that. And for why we're here, in conversation with our guest is Pratt's very own Naila Whitaker. Our guest is the author of 2 novels for adults, Chasing the Sun and Everyone Knows You Go Home, which won an International Latino Book Award. Running, her debut novel for young adults, is a 2020 Junior Library Guild selection. Born in Lima, Peru, Sylvester grew up in Florida and Texas and received a BFA in creative writing from the University of Miami. So please give us a warm welcome for our author, Natalia Sylvester.
Good morning, everybody, to everybody in the room and online. Welcome to our conversation. I am so excited to meet this author of this wonderful book, Running. We are going to start off by having her talk a little bit about the book and do a little bit of a reading, and then we'll get started into our conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you to everyone at the Pratt Library for having me. I'm so honored, and it's a real pleasure. So Running is actually the story of a 15-year-old girl living in Miami, Florida, and she's Cuban American, and her father is running for president of the United States. And she's always just kind of supported him. She stood behind him as he does his speeches, and it's her sophomore year, and she's kind of realizing that, as his campaign progresses, she's realizing that her political views don't necessarily align with his, and so now she has to make a decision and really kind of decide, like, what do I do with that? Will she speak up about it, or will she just keep supporting him in just this very quiet manner in which she always has? So I thought I'd read a scene in the very beginning of the book where she is actually, she and her family are like filming like a segment to help promote his campaign. And they're kind of just like pretending to be this very perfect all-American family, and she's feeling really annoyed by all the, just the whole facade of it. And so the only thing you need to know is like a few characters real quick, is that Joe is someone who works for her dad for his campaign, and he kind of tends to really try to tell her what to do, and so they have her, he's trying to get her to rehearse some lines for like when she gets interviewed and things like that. Joe looks my way like he just noticed I'm here. Mariana, why don't you show your parents what you've been practicing for the interview? I should have stayed in the bathroom longer. Joe's been writing out these note cards with lines that he thinks will make my dad sound good. He wants me to memorize them without seeming too rehearsed. Papi looks at me wide-eyed with his mouth half open, the same way Ricky looks when he's playing video games, like he's expecting something spectacular. Mommy sighs and says, "Go on, hijita." I feel every muscle from my stomach to my toes tense, and I take a deep breath. I know my father will make a good president because... I pause. It's hard for me to get the words out. They've been shoved down my throat for so long now, saying them feels like regurgitating. Even worse, Joe thinks I've paused because he taught me to. He said it makes me appear more genuine, like the thoughts are just now occurring to me. Because he's my hero, and he's never let me down, I say. My parents look like they're about to cry. I feel like I might too. It's not that the words are a lie. It's just that who even talks like that? When Joe originally asked me the question, I answered, well, because Bobby works super hard, like night and day. He's working his butt off. And yeah, I know that's not exactly presidential daughter material, but it could have been finessed. Joe didn't even bother. He didn't even butcher what I said. More like he took an order for ham and offered up sliced cheese. And now I'll be humiliated in front of 2.5 million people. That's the show's viewership. One of the highest, if you ask Joe. Or even if you don't, he'll still brag about it to anyone who'll listen. That's excellent, excellent, Joe says. Just don't be afraid to be yourself, okay? Just act natural. He's always saying that. Joe talks like we're close friends, when in reality, he barely knows me. He just thinks he does. We shoot footage for another hour and a half. If this shoot and the interview go well, Papi and his staff plan on launching a live stream of his campaign. There'll be cameras everywhere he goes, which means everywhere we go when he's with us. I can't imagine anything worse. Our lives are being turned into a cheap presidential election version of The Bachelor. Would Jackie start writing about me then too, with so much fresh material to pick through? I pull out my phone and hit delete on her Twitter request. Whatever it is she wants with me, it can't be good. Joe scribbles another line on a pink note card and hands it to me. It's about how much Papi loves Miami. Real subtle stuff. I fold the note card in half, then into quarters and eighths, until it's a tiny wad so thick it won't bend any further. Papi glances at my hand, but I hide the paper in my palm before he can see what I've done to it. You'll be perfect, he says. Perfect. No pressure or anything. Just perfect. Thank you.
I want to start off by, now that everyone's heard about the book and just the scene from the book, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with your story, especially in the room. Could you talk a little bit about the characters, about the story, and things of that nature for our
Yeah.
audience?
So Maddie is the main character, and she's a sophomore. She has a little brother named Ricky, and her dad who's running for president. And throughout the course of the book, she's kind of always been in his camp, but then a few things happen that makes her start to doubt, like, how come some of the things he says he stands for don't really necessarily line up with his actions. And one thing in particular, there ends up being like a health crisis in her community in Miami that impacts her best friend, Dee, and she ends up, I guess, starting to see everything around her with new eyes and kind of connecting the dots between the way her dad's work and the policies that he's put into place are now affecting her local community. And she's kind of confused at first because she thought, like, well, I thought you stood for, like, she sees him, like, volunteer at, like, beach cleanups, so she was like, oh, okay, I thought you cared about climate change. But it doesn't necessarily line up with his actions. And so she ends up meeting a friend, she ends up encountering Jackie, one of the people who I mentioned in the book. Jackie is an activist at her school, who in the beginning of the book she really doesn't, she kind of tends to stay away from because her father sees her as a troublemaker, or, like, as he calls her, a malcriada. But throughout the course of the book, Maddie starts to kind of understand a little better what people in her school are doing, and she joins an activist group called Poder, which is it's an acronym, but it also translates to power in Spanish. And there's a lot of just different people in her life that bring new perspectives, and that kind of help her to start to think about, like, well, what role do I want to play in all this?
Starting to read the book, I came in thinking, okay, everybody has a set character and a set role to play. And I think that's how Maddie, she believed that she was supposed to be this perfect, upstanding daughter. Follow what the rules say, don't color outside of the lines, don't make friends, but I still want this life. Sort of like probably how the Obamas felt when they walked into the White House. Being a black and brown family, the world is watching, just like Maddie is, preparing for election. So that's how I had to see the story. But as time went on, Maddie starts getting this voice, and she starts getting a little scared of this voice because her mom is telling her to do one thing, her brother is kind of watching her as I'm looking up, and her father actually has an expectation. When it comes to young people, like how did you, well, I guess I want to ask, the first question I want to ask is, how did you come up with this story, like with Madi, and just trying to figure out her voice and where she stands in this community that she's in, these many small communities that she's in?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So the inspiration for the story was originally that I was, this was around the 2016 election campaign, in the middle, like probably around July or something. There was, I was watching the news, I was having breakfast one morning, you know, like you're just like kind of sitting on your couch having cereal. And there was a candidate who was announcing his, you know, that he was dropping out of the campaign. And he was standing on the stage, and there was a young girl standing behind him. And I could tell that was his daughter. And she had this look on her face that I just couldn't stop trying to figure out. Like, I just was like, is she disappointed? Is she crushed? Is she proud? Like, it just felt like there were so many conflicting emotions. And, you know, as a fiction writer, I ask a lot of what ifs, right? And so I just start imagining from things, and, you know, the world around you becomes like a springboard for other questions that you ask. And so I just became really curious about this young girl, and it was no longer necessarily, you know, whoever was on the television. It was just this person that I was now imagining in my mind. And it was Maddie, and it was just, you know, she has always grown up saying, from her family being told things like, don't talk back to your father. You know, he's the authority figure, you have to respect him, you have to be a well-behaved girl. What will people think if you aren't? So there's all this pressure for her to be well-behaved in the public eye and to be like a perfect daughter. And I was just really curious about what happens when that's completely in conflict with the person you're becoming. You know, she's been afraid to speak up because she has literally been told to keep quiet. You know, in a lot of Latinx cultures, there's sometimes this expression a lot of us are used to hearing, which is "calladita te ves más bonita," which means, you know, when you're quiet, you look prettier. Which is a horrible thing to tell a young girl. So she's kind of working against these cultural and, you know, a lot of family dynamics that have been embedded in her, and she's trying to break free from them. And that translates not just to her literal voice, but just to how, who she'll be as like a, you know, a person active in her community.
Yeah. So, just to get a little participation from everybody in the room and even online, if you could raise your hand, I know everybody can't see online, how many people have unspoken rules that your parents or guardians may? I know I've had some. You know, come in the house on time, they may not set a certain time, go to school, clean up your room, those kind of things. So that's how my body felt. You know, there were some unspoken things. Like, how do you appear online? How hard was it for you to, how much of a challenge was it for you to write this book about this fictional character in her life and the unspoken rules and things like that?
I mean, every book is challenging in its own way. I definitely, at first, so to write from the point of view of a 15-year-old girl is obviously challenging for me as an adult. But it also is just such an enormous privilege because it really forces you to remember, like, what was that like? I remember so many things that happened to me when I was 15 that really were life-changing. And I wanted to give them that weight, you know, in Maddie's life too. So, but I think also, you know, when you mentioned even how they want to control her online life, like they actually literally go in and delete all her profiles.
Yeah.
And they put them all on private, and then they replace them with all these pictures that they think will look better to the world, and so she feels like she's been turned into a bot. And I think that even though I didn't necessarily like experience growing up, and my father never ran for president, you know, that's still something that I think so many of us could relate to because we are expected to act a certain way. You know, the thing that became pretty challenging was really just finding out, like, well, what is it like to have a parent run for president? You know, and that really involved a lot of research, and I read a lot of memoirs, written by not just presidential candidates, but family members of presidential candidates, and I watched a lot of documentaries, and you know, just read up on a lot of articles, and just kind of looked at, like, you know, how do people get treated when they're in the public eye that way? it's very different, especially like you mentioned, Sasha and Amelia, like it's very different when you're a woman of color. And the expectations put on young Black women, young Latina women, there is just, we don't necessarily get seen as like the typical all-American family, even though we are. And that's just because, you know, we have had this long history of mostly white male, I mean, presidents, except for one. And so, you know, that kind of was it was a challenge, but it was a welcome one.
You brought up so many good things that I want to talk about. Gosh. Well, let me ask another question while I come back to that. When you were writing, did you have a specific outcome when you first got the idea for the book? Or did you just let the story just take form, just in case we have any writers online or in the room that want to explore the idea of writing?
Yeah, you know, it's a little bit of both. So when I start writing, I have an idea. It's usually something that will kind of like sit in my head for a little before I even start putting it down, and it just kind of persists. Yeah, like, and I call it like the marinating period. Like it's just, you just let it like soak up all the juices. It's like if you want, like imagine if you marinated a steak or something, right? And you just set it aside for a bit because you're letting it soak up all the flavors. That's how I am with my ideas. Like I want to make sure that they're not just like a tiny idea that I might not be able to sustain for a whole book, because this book took me 2 years to write. And so you have to really, you know, love an idea to kind of keep up, you know, feel pretty passionate about it to stick with it that long. But on the other hand, there were certain things that I knew I wanted to happen in the book, and then there were other things that totally took me by surprise, and that that's my favorite part, is like to allow that to happen. And so like one example would be like, I knew that there was going to be some sort of crisis, some sort of thing that happens in Miley's life that can be tied back to her dad and his policies, that then she would then realize like, what can I do about this? And I really thought that by the end of the book, it meant that she had to somehow change the world. Like it just felt very intimidating to think like, what is a big enough thing to happen in her community and for her to do that will sustain a whole book? Like how will it feel like it's, by the end it feels like worth it, right? And what I realized as I wrote the book is it's like I was kind of going through a lot of what Maddie's going through, is that realizing like, you don't have to change the whole world for it to be a totally valid effort. Like you can start small, like even small changes can change someone else's world, right? And can be a huge impact and can create all these domino effects. And I think, you know, that's true for her activism, but it's also true for when we write. Like there's no such thing as a small story. Like I sometimes struggle with that. I feel like the stories and the ideas that I want to tell, I feel like they're small, because maybe I haven't necessarily seen them reflected as much, or I haven't seen them amplified as much. And that's a lie. Like all our stories matter, and they're, you know, they're big to us, and and if we haven't seen them reflected out in the world yet, that's even more of a reason to give them our all and to put them out there, because maybe someone else needs it just as much as we do.
When you started doing your research and you were reading your books and stuff like that, was there a starting point for you, like, I'm just going to read this kind of book, or did one book just lead you to another? When you started doing research for Madi and her family, did you have some books in mind? Did you have a playlist that you listened to, or you just said, I'm just going to dive in and start reading about different political figures and things like that?
I kind of went a little all over the place.
Okay.
I try not to limit myself when I'm researching, and also not even just, I mean, aside from the researching, there's also, I'll read a lot of fiction as well, and it might not have anything to do with my book, but it just inspires me. Like I feel like to me, reading is the thing that nourishes my writing. Like I feel like I have to expose myself to writing that I love and to stories that inspire me and that remind me like, wow, this is why I do what I do in order to continue, because it's, you know, writing is such a, it's really, like to me, it's incredibly difficult. Like I think there's a misconception that people think that because you have a book and that you've written, it means that it's easy for you. And it's like, no, actually, it means that it's probably a lot harder for you, but you keep going anyways. Because, you know, you're there trying to make it its absolute best. And writing is this strange process of trying to discover who you are and what you're trying to say at the very exact moment that you're putting it on the page. And then the page kind of has a way of telling, like showing you things you didn't realize you were even thinking. You know, like, have you ever had a moment like that where you're like, I didn't even realize I was feeling this way, but just writing it down made it really clear to me. So it's almost like this conversation that you're having with yourself and with the page as you go. And so I feel like, to me, to kind of make that conversation feel less isolated and less like it's just me talking to myself, I like to just bring in all these other works, you know, and really allow myself to be inspired by them.
So for those that do write like poetry, if you write raps and things like that, that's like a good way, a segue into if you want to get into writing.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about some of your favorite characters versus the characters that like, oh my goodness, do I really have to write this character? Like, it was Joe for me.
Yeah.
And then it became Irving. Was there any characters that you did not like? We'll start there. Was there characters that like kind of irked you a little bit, but they were important to the story?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Joe. I mean, you're not the first person to tell me that. Like, I think almost every event I've done with this book, people will be like, I really hated Joe.
Yeah.
And I'll be like, I know, me too. But, you know, it's funny because at one point I had taken a workshop while I was writing this book. I was taking a workshop with the Cuban-American author Cristina Garcia. And she said that sometimes you need to write your oppressor. And it, right, and and she said it in a way that, so basically, like, write, whether it's a person, whether it's a force, you know, like a group of persons, whether it's a system, you know, but that is either in some way harming you, or if you feel like it's an obstacle or has affected you in some negative way, to write that and to put it on paper is allowing it to have a little less power over you. And she meant it not that I needed to put it in the story, but that I had to get it out, so that I'm not carrying it, like that it's not weighing me down, that I'm just able to just be like, there it is, I know it's there, but I'm still here, I'm still me, I'm still telling my story, but now I know and I've named it. And so that makes me more powerful because I can see your secrets, right? And so I wrote like a couple of pages from the point of view of Joe really early on in this draft. And so I kind of knew where he was coming from, and now I knew what Mari was dealing with. And to me that was important because he really is someone who represents so much of what Mari goes through in terms of, you know, how a young woman of color like her is the world kind of tries to control her and tell her how she needs to act in the world, what she's expected to think and say, who she's not supposed to challenge, who she's not supposed to raise her voice against. And so knowing who he was, now I knew what she was up against. And in a way now she knew what she was up against. And so even though it's funny, and I know a lot of people love to hate Joe, but he does represent a lot of things that to me were very grating and I needed to give voice to, but I didn't want to censor it. Like, I didn't want him to be like the center of the book. Like, I wanted Mari's voice and Mari's power to be the heart of the book, to be like the sun of it, and everything else can revolve around it. Sorry, I think I might have gone on to a tangent now. I don't remember what the original question was.
I'm glad you talked about Joe because that helped me understand him a little bit more. Talk about the father a little bit, because there were times where it seemed like he was kind of like defeated. He felt powerless because the more that Mari gained her voice, and even her mother a little bit, she was like getting her voice through Mari as she was starting to grow and mature. It seemed like Dad was like struggling with some things. Was that hard to deal, to not make him larger than life versus like more human, and he has struggles too?
Yeah, it was really hard. You know, actually, I love that you mentioned that, because in really early drafts of this book, you mentioned like he's larger than life. He kind of took up all the space in the room. Like he would take, and not just like in this literal way, but almost, or not just in a figurative way, but almost literally in the first drafts, like, he was the most prominent figure to the point that Maddie's mom was so far in the background that at one point I actually realized I had not given her a name.
I noticed that. I was like, what are these people's names? For a minute. I had to like look through. Yeah, you're right.
No, and I thought like, I remember when I realized that, I was like, oh gosh, this is so not feminist of me. Like, how did I let her just go into the background? But I realized because that's whose Maddie's dad is. He was the one who always needed to be the center of the attention. He's the head of the family. He likes having that power, and so his whole career has been about building more and more of that power, regardless of the consequences. And I felt like it was my job in later drafts, because that's kind of how writing is. Like, you write a first draft, and then you see what you've done with it, and then you kind of go back, and you then fix it, or make it stronger. And so for me, my task in the subsequent drafts was saying, like, okay, when he's been in the room taking up all the air, what have people like Maddie's mom, like Juliana and Maddie, been doing and been wanting to do, and what are their journeys? Not just, almost in spite of him, right? And so Maddie, in a way, like, Maddie's mom has always supported her dad, and in a lot of ways she silenced herself in order to do that. And when Maddie starts to do the opposite, it also inspires her mom. And it's just, like, to me, it just became such an example of, like, we do such a disservice to think that just because someone isn't 18 yet, and because they can't vote, that they don't have power. Like, you don't, like, the vote is not the only form of power. Like, your voice is powerful, your entire life is powerful, like, your presence, your being, like, you just by virtue of being you, that is powerful. And so, and for Maddie to learn that ends up really inspiring her mom as well.
Ricky.
Oh, Ricky, I love Ricky.
That's her little brother.
Her little brother. Yeah, Ricky is like 8 years old, and he just totally is #1 fan of her dad. Like, he does not bother to question him. He's kind of where Maddie was when she was younger. So, and who knows, what his journey will be. But I kind of wanted to plant those seeds.
Yeah, in him. Yeah. And it's nice to see how he was finding his voice, like when he got mad at her for thinking that she ruined Dad's campaign.
Yeah.
I don't want to give away what happened. That might be a small giveaway, but he gets mad at her at several points in the book while he's still idolizing his dad, and rightfully so. Two people, Addie Addis, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, and Gloria. They were quiet yet essential points that it was like an aha for her when she started doing her own probing about her dad.
Yeah.
Can you talk about them? What made you make them part of the book?
Yeah. So Gloria is actually Gloria works at Maddie's house. She's like she's the maid. She's a live-in maid, and she cooks and cleans, and but also she's a confidant of Maddie's. Like, Maddie really looks up to her. And I think Gloria is such a huge part of the book. Actually, she's like the first word in the story. She's the first line I wrote. I think that, and then Maddie is Gloria's girlfriend. And in the beginning of the book, Maddie doesn't know that Maddie and Gloria are together, because Gloria has always referred to Maddie as her roommate. Or at least Maddie thinks that. She can't remember if she assumed that, or, but basically Gloria always felt that she had to do that because she didn't necessarily feel safe to be, like, open and true to her own self, and in this environment in which she knows that Maddie's dad is homophobic. And so, to me, I just think that it's important that, Maddie is in a position where she's kind of starting to realize the privilege that she has. Like, yes, she has experienced xenophobia, she's experienced being othered, there are certainly ways in which she has experienced oppression, but it doesn't mean she is not capable of also, and not just her, but her family. It doesn't mean that they're not also capable of perpetuating it, and also they're a very powerful family. So I just really thought it was important that that we examine all the ways that when we do have power, what are we doing with it? And to me, like, to have that even happening in their own household where there's different levels of privilege because of socioeconomic reasons, because of the different power dynamics in Amari's like working for her dad. And it became such a, I guess like just in a way to show that like how much of the personal or the political truly is personal. It's not just, you know, people in DC like talking about policy. It's like real people being affected every single day in like these big and small ways. And I think Gloria is one of the first people who she realizes is being affected by that.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't realize that until the issue with the water, and then her best friend is affected, and then they have asked the people to stop buying bottled water, and the family members in the hospital and things like that. And we don't understand how things are so interconnected.
Absolutely.
Until someone close to us is affected.
Yeah.
Just to take a break for a minute, if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat. Someone will get them to us, and we'll definitely have a moment to ask the author. Please ask anything that you would like about the book. We will talk about her new book in a moment. For anyone in the room, if you haven't, please write your questions or share any comments, ask ideas about her writing, becoming an author, or anything like that. Speaking of which, before you were a writer, what was your previous life?
Oh goodness. That's almost hard to tell because I've always been writing.
Okay.
I started writing basically when I started to learn to read, and I loved it so much. And the reason I think I loved it so much is that it was really hard for me to learn to read. I came to the U.S. from Peru when I was 4, and when I started school in like kindergarten, I wasn't yet fluent in English, and so it was a real struggle for me to learn English. And then once I did learn English, we right away were like, cool, let's learn to read, and that was incredibly difficult for me because what you're supposed. I think now people know that in order to teach a non-native speaker to read in one language, you should teach them to read in their native language, and then they will use those skills to learn to read in a new language. But they didn't do that with me, and I don't think people really knew that at the time. And so I was like translating as I was learning to read, and it was just such a challenge that by the time I figured it out, I just kind of loved it. It made me really value it. And so I started writing when I was like 6 years old. I didn't realize that I could call myself a writer, so I wasn't really calling myself a writer at the time. So I would say my whole like childhood and even my teen years and when I was in college, there were all these other things I said I would do. So I was like, I'm going to become a doctor. I'm going to become an architect. I'm going to become a graphic designer. I'm going to go into advertising. I'm going to go into public relations. Like I tried all these things. I was a journalist, and I still am. I actually did do that one. But the whole time, I didn't realize the one thing that had been constant in my life was that I was writing. And so it's an interesting thing because it's like realizing now, like, what did I do? My life before I was writing was actually still writing. Okay. I think the difference was, do you allow yourself that? I think a lot of us struggle with feeling like maybe our stories aren't important enough, or maybe writing is hard, so it feels like maybe this isn't the right thing to do. And I'm like, it's super hard for me. It's just, I love it so much. I just keep going. And I don't know, I think that's something that I hope any writer who is thinking about it, like, realizes that, like, it's okay if and I would say, like, the rewriting is the heart of it. Like, my mentor in college, Evelina Galan, she once said that, she told me, she was like, your first draft is self-expression, and the art is in revision. And so it's not supposed to come easy, but the process in itself is really rewarding. Even just the rewriting and the refiguring out what you're trying to say, and then figuring out how to say it in a way that's more clear. It's just, it's great.
You bring up a quote that I saw For those of you, I was really researching about her because I really wanted to have a really great conversation with you. And one of the quotes that you said was you want the fiction, well, let me read it. Fiction allows the writer to ask questions. So I'm going to say that part. What questions were you trying to get your book running to ask?
Oh gosh, I think there's so many, and actually, I think sometimes by the time I finish writing, I find that I have new questions. I don't necessarily have answers; I just have other questions. But what I started with writing was really just, yeah, well, like what happens when the people you love don't necessarily see eye to eye with you, and it's not just about politics. It ends up feeling, and it is truly personal, because what it kind of feels like is maybe they don't love and care in the same way you love and care about the world around you. And so it's incredibly hurtful, and it's really, it becomes like this deeply, almost like self-identifying crisis, you know, especially when you're young, because as you're forming those ideas about how you want to like carry yourself throughout the world, what kind of change you want to like be a part of, a lot of those things often come from those closest to us early in our lives, whether it's our family, whether it's a parent or an authority figure, but also other times it comes from the art we read and the music we listen to and the people we look up to, and so those things can become at odds. And it's I just didn't know, like, is there a way to come to terms with that or to navigate it without without betraying everything you stand for, and without betraying who you are. And I don't know the exact answers. It's still an incredibly difficult thing to navigate when someone you love isn't, you know,
Who you think they are, like the ideal
yeah,
of my world, and
right,
they become something else, and something else moves in its place.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like a repurposing almost. Your new book. What questions are you asked? Talk about your new book and what questions are you asking in that one?
Oh, absolutely. So my next book comes out in May, and it's called Breathe and Count Back from 10. And it's about a 17-year-old Peruvian American girl living in Central Florida who has hip dysplasia, which is a hip condition that I have, that I was born with. And she is trying to audition. It all takes place during a summer where she's falling in love for the first time, and also auditioning to become a mermaid at a Central Florida theme park where mermaids, you know, where swimmers put on tails and perform and dance underwater. And I think, wow, there's so many questions with this one. Honestly, this book became a book about me just learning. I almost kind of wrote it for my teenage self or anyone else who felt that way growing up, to kind of learn to love your body in a world that can often tell it that your disabilities make you somehow less than, or in a world that somehow makes you feel that way, or in a world that doesn't necessarily treat disabled people in the same way. And that's incredibly difficult to navigate, and it can create an inner narrative that's very hurtful and that we end up perpetuating. And I wanted to know, like, what does it look like to break free of that, and to really just embrace yourself and become the person that you need, for your own sake. You know, not to please others, not to do what's expected of you. I think a lot of times I am exploring this idea of, like, what does it mean to have, like, full power and agency, right? And not let others tell you who to be.
Yeah, I love it. I can't wait for this new book.
Thank you.
I want to continue to ask questions, but I would like to engage our audience more in our conversation. We have some questions from the audience. If anyone online has questions, please bring them in. As you can see, she is very welcoming and open, and she's here to ask questions. I am going to start with the first one. Have you ever had any doubts about writing? If so, what were they? Oh, that's a great question.
That is the one.
Oh,
Thank you
God.
for that question.
Thank you.
I have. Oh my gosh, so many. I still have them, like to this day. Every single time I sit down to write, I promise. um, there's always this voice that like either says this is a terrible story, or these are not good sentences, or who are you to think to dare to tell this story? That doesn't necessarily, at least for me, it hasn't necessarily gone away, and I don't mean that to discourage anyone. I mean it to say, kind of like what I was talking about earlier, is like to name the, to name the oppressor, or to name the things that are like, are obstacles. I kind of see myself, doubt as like this like monster that sometimes rears its ugly head, and it's done it so many times now that it's a little less scary each time, because I know that if it's happened for every single one of my books and every story I've ever written, and I know that I've kept writing despite it, and it's come out okay in the end, then I feel like, well, that gives it a little less power, and I know all its tricks. So I think any writer will tell you they go through that.
I'm going to ask this next question. This is a good one too. 2 years from draft to publisher, how did you stay focused? It's a good question.
Yeah, that is a great question.
Yeah, these are good questions.
Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah. I really am someone who takes really small steps for a long time, and it adds up. I try not to fixate on, why didn't I write 5 chapters today? And it's really more, did I show up and write something I'm proud of? Like, there were days when I wrote 1 line. There were days when I wrote 1,000 words. There were days when I wrote 200 words. And I didn't always write every single day. I know that there's this idea of like, you have to write every day or else you're not a writer. But I don't believe that, because I think that writing looks different in so many ways. Sometimes I was walking my dogs down the block, and I was still thinking about Maddie, and I was working things out in my head, and that was still writing. And then other times I was just tired and I needed a break, and the rest is part of the work, And so I think that really, but what I did do, I guess over 2 years, is that I kept coming back, and I kept, maybe it wasn't like I said every day, but it was a timeline, and I was committed to it, and I just thought, all I need to do is be consistent in some way, whatever that looks like for you, to just keep making these small steps, because the time's gonna pass. 6 months from now, it's still gonna have been 6 months, and so will I look back and think, oh, I have like these pages to show for it at least, right? And even if it's a small amount, it added up, and that's really how I finish all my books.
What was it like to get into the mind of the characters?
That's my favorite part. It's just because you're experiencing new things, you're seeing the world through different eyes, but it also feels deeply personal because it's still connected to you. One of the interesting things about writing Maddie, though, is because she's 15, and remember I said I've been writing since I was like 6? I have all my journals from when I was 6 up until now. So I kind of cheat sometimes. Like, I go back and I read my journals from when I was whatever age my character was, and it helps me remember what it was like to see the world through those eyes. And it helps me realize, like, I need to honor this moment in time. Like, I want to make sure to be true to it. And it helps me remember, like, what were the things that were important to me as a 15-year-old? And with Breathe and Count Back from 10, I read my 17-year-old journals. So that's been a real treasure for me.
Oh, wow. So hold on to those journals and essays. You never know how important it's going to be to a future story or just job idea. Who was your favorite character to write?
Oh, wow. Oh, that's a tough one. Oh, it's so hard to choose a favorite. I think it changes every day. I'm going to just say today, actually, okay, I really loved writing Jackie because she surprised me. Because in the very beginning, like I mentioned, Maddie kind of sees her as like an antagonistic figure, and she's kind of really scared and intimidated by her. And I won't give anything away, but she really did surprise me, and I loved
me too.
Yeah, and I think she's just like wonderful and fierce, and I kind of wish I was more like her.
I'll stand in line on that one too. Do you have another book in the pipeline?
Yes.
And for those that don't know, you've written 2 adult books.
I have, yeah.
So, how is it different to write for a young audience?
Yeah.
That's a great question.
Yeah, oh, that is a great question. It was in a lot of ways harder. And I think that anyone who thinks it is not, or who assumes that, writing for a younger audience is in any way easier, I just feel like that's just, again, a complete disservice to like the complexity of, what it means to be like a teenager and be experiencing so many things that are shaping you and so many things that make you feel new or feel like firsts. So I think it was, in a way, like again, it was a welcome challenge because I wanted to really be able to say, okay, has anyone ever told you, like, oh, none of this will matter when you're older, right? And I think that's such a lie. I think that actually all of this matters because it's making you who you are. And so for me, like I think the challenge was to say, how can I make sure to put on the page why this matters so much to Maddie, and really like be true to that. And a lot of that kind of, it took me like setting aside like all my, the ways that we kind of like can forget things, how fresh they were when we were a little older, and really putting myself back there. And that was, yeah, it was great, it was fun. I think writing YA keeps us young.
I like that. How many drafts did you go through before you reached the final draft?
I don't know. It's hard. You lose track. You do. I mean, because it's like one draft might be a complete rewrite. Another one might be like that you're tweaking things and polishing things. Another one is like you just decide like, oh gosh, this is a whole, like I sometimes will add an entirely new subplot at the like a third or fourth draft. Like with the what happened with Maddie's mom, that didn't happen until almost the second to last draft. And I won't give it away, but there's something that happens with Maddie's mom at the end. So yeah, it's hard. I don't really, it's hard to keep track. I would say probably at least anywhere between like 7 and 12.
Wow.
Yeah.
In what way is Miami also a character in this book?
Oh, I love that question. Yes. Oh my God, Miami is totally a character.
But yeah, it is.
Yes. Oh, I think so. I really thought of this book, like, so at the time I was writing this book, I was living in Austin. I lived in Austin for 11 years. And, but I grew up in Miami. I went to high school and college in Miami. And I really thought of this book as like my love letter to Miami. But it also means that you're not just, talking about all the things you love about Miami. You can also talk about the things that are that you wish were different. And so I wanted to talk about like some of the corruption and the politics and all the ways that, like, for example, like Miami has a huge immigrant community, but it doesn't mean that we're all the same. Actually the very opposite of that. We all have like such different, aside from being from different parts of the globe, that also comes with like, different life experiences, different faiths, different, just in every spectrum you can imagine. And so I wanted really to bring that to life. And I don't think this book could have, in this form, would have happened in any other way than Miami. And I had a lot of fun actually writing about the different landmarks, having Maddie actually move through the space of Miami. Like she at one point participates in a protest march. So, I have like a very specific image in my head of where it is in place that she's moving through. And I think that setting is a hugely important part of not just a story and as a character, but like, where we grow up, where we live, it shapes who we become. So it made sense to have that be a character.
I agree. Thank you for that. Were there any questions from our online audience? Nope. Nope. Okay. Is there anything else you would like to add? This was such a great conversation. I see. No, it was no questions?
No.
Oh, okay. Gosh, what else is there? That last question was a really good question. Any hobbies or anything that you're interested in that kind of keeps you motivated? Reading, or just not even connected to writing or reading, but just in general. What keeps you motivated in general? Especially because this book, for those that don't realize, this book came out during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So how more important were your hobbies and interests while keeping you inspired?
Oh gosh, so much. I love that you asked that, like, what are they outside of writing, because for a long time there wasn't a lot that I did outside of reading and writing. And it became so important for me to find things to do outside of that, because on the days when the writing is hard, I need to know that I'm more than the words I put on the page. Because if I'm having a hard time with the writing, then that means I'm having a hard time with myself, and it can really wear me down, and it can really make it, like, the negative self-talk becomes overwhelming. And so finding things outside of that to identify with and to make me realize, like, I'm also this person. Like, I'm also, like, a good friend to the people in my life, and a good sister, and a good partner to my husband, and I have interests outside of this that, like, that nurture me. Like, something that I've ended up discovering in the pandemic is that I love to take care of plants. I never knew that. I always killed my plants. And then the pandemic kind of forced me to be like, okay, why am I killing my plants? Like, what am I doing wrong? And I grew to really love them. And I think it just taught me to just really be patient. You know, like, when you plant something, it takes forever to grow, but it doesn't mean that there aren't things happening below the surface.
Yeah.
And okay, and even though I say I need to not to be about writing, it still relates back to writing, you guys, because I think that's a lot how writing is. Like, you're planning ideas, and you have to be patient with them, and you have to nurture them. But I think that's true of anything we do with ourselves. And so, yeah, I really, so in high school I played volleyball, and I also danced, and so I you know, it became kind of hard to keep up with a lot of those things in the pandemic, but I try to stay connected to, a lot of times when I do, when I exercise, it helps my hip. Because so my character in Read and Count Back from 10, you know, has hip dysplasia, and it causes a lot of pain. It affects, you know, it causes her to limp. It's all about just the difference and kind of an unalignment in her bones, and that's the case with me. And so when I'm exercising, it helps me manage my pain, but it also helps me get out of my head and become a little bit more focused on the physical world, and a little less focused on all the voices that kind of can be full of doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that is all the time we have. Thank you for
Thank you
your
so much.
conversation. I enjoyed this. I hope everybody in our audience there and online, thank you for coming into the Pratt room with us. We'd like to say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so
Give her a
much.
hand.
Yeah, on behalf of the Pratt, thank you for everyone that tuned in virtually and in person. And make sure to check out our website for our next few events. Thank you again to Natalia Sylvester.
You know,
Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
bye, thank you.
Thank you.